to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I am your co-host, Scott Parkin. Today, calling in from the Tahoe National Forest. And as always, I am joined by...
I'm Bob Bazenko, and I'm in Ohio today. And as always, we open by thanking all of you for listening on whichever platform you choose, watching on YouTube, and ask that you continue to support us, subscribe, rate and review, which is really important. We get feedback, but it would be really great if you could go on and rate and review it and help those algorithms out. And then we're all over social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we put different stuff up there too. Like yesterday was Woody Guthrie's birthday, so we had a little thing about that. So try to follow us on all that media, and we really do appreciate all of your support. We're getting bigger, we're growing, more and more people are listening and watching, so thank you.
And just a shout out to Bob. Last night he was actually, which by the time this airs will probably be last week, but he was on Flashpoints with Dennis Bernstein talking about the situation in Cuba. And so, check that out if you get a chance. And then if you also really love Green and Red Podcast, you can become a donor or a patron and check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/Green Red Podcast. Or you can go to our website, greenandredpodcast.org, and hit the support button and make a one-time donation. But without further ado, we're very excited for our guest that we've been scheduling with and working to get on for a minute. And so today we're going to be joined by Professor Richard Wolff. Professor Wolff is a professor of economics emeritus from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he taught economics from 1973 to 2008. He's also the founding director of Democracy at Work, and is published in outlets such as The Guardian, Truth Out, Common Dreams, and then also is just a flavor of what we're going to talk about. Professor Wolff is a well-known critic of contemporary capitalism and a leading proponent of an alternative economic system based on workers' self-directed enterprises. So welcome to Green and Red, Professor Wolff.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Yep. And so we're going to just kind of kick it off with some just like general questions about the economy. Economists, the media, politicians, especially conservatives, say that government should stay out of the economy, should let business operate on their own and succeed and fail according to the market, quote unquote. But the government creates taxes, tariffs, subsidizes many large industries, creates or eliminates regulations, issues patents, which clearly help the ruling class get more wealthy and powerful. Professor Wolff, do you want to just briefly explain how this economy works in reality for our audience?
Sure. Let me start by picking up on the theme you just began with. The notion that there could be an economy that was somehow uninvolved with, free from, independent of the government is the worst sort of make-believe imaginable. You could, if you wanted to be kind to the people who believe this, you could imagine it as a kind of utopian fantasy. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we didn't have a government telling us what to do and passing laws that we have to observe and regulations we have to abide by and all of that? I understand there's a yearning there to be, if you like, free. And I appreciate that yearning. There's some good things that come from that yearning. But that's a different matter than claiming that we are about to go into some process whereby we get rid of the government. Let me be crystal clear about this. The history of capitalism, which is usually thought to have modern capitalism, thought to have started in Britain in the 17th, 18th century, and slowly spread to the global system it is today, has been in bed with, deeply intertwined with the government from day one. The very separation out of and away from the previous economic systems, feudalism and slavery, these breaks were achieved when capitalists were able finally to capture the government and use the government to finish off the old system and establish the new one. we're in the month of July. The month of July celebrates both the French and American revolutions, which happened a few years from one another. And both of them were breaks from a feudalism that was being rejected in favor of a capitalism that was being created. We in the United States broke away from the feudal kingdom of George III in Great Britain. And we didn't establish another feudalism here. We got rid of feudalism, we got rid of kings, all of that apparatus, and we did it by a bloody, violent revolution that finished that project off. It had been going on for a long time. So literally the birth of this country and its history to this minute have never come anywhere close to having the economy free from, away from, liberated from the government. So this is, again, to be kind, it's a utopian fantasy that should never be confused with the reality. Another way to say the same thing. If money makes the world go round, please remember that in our society, the government has a monopoly to make the money. And if you do it, they will arrest you and put you in one of their jails, which should be as crystal clear an example of who controls what as I can imagine. And of course, you gave a list of dozens of other ways that the government is involved. And one more little ironic twist. Never has this economic system we live in, US capitalism, never has it been more dependent on the government than it is now. Right now, 2021. I mean, we've had real breakthroughs in the last few years, especially in the last year. Before this year, the Federal Reserve never lent brand new, fresh money directly to corporations. It does that now. The United States did not give out huge amounts of money, literally in checks, to the population. Yesterday started the checks to the children for the child support. We've had other kinds of checks, as you know, for the pandemic. I mean, this is a society that is on life support from the government. It's capitalism literally holding on by the edge of its fingernails to the one thing that keeps it going now, and that's the government. So to my libertarian friends, I have to say, with all due respect, what planet are you living on? So let me begin, with that.
Right. The first day of every semester, I begin with that because, there's this notion out there and I say there's no such thing as these free markets. And I'll use public funded stadiums as an example where you have socialized debt, but private ownership. So that was wonderful to hear how you said that. And then you mentioned the checks that gone out, and that's actually a perfect segue because I had that written down. It was as if we planned this out ahead of time. But after the COVID shocks of early 20, actually even before the COVID shocks of early 2020 and late 2019, you started to see this, and then really it hit hard, like around March or so of 2020. The government stepped in amid the worst economic crisis probably since 1929, since the Great Depression. It's issued checks in the 1,200 first, then 600, then 1,400 to kind of typical taxpayers. But it's also helped banks and corporations with these vast amounts of money. So I was just gonna, maybe you could explain these, what they call their stimulus programs, and especially you mentioned the Fed, which was in my question as well, and talk about the way the Fed has entered into these markets in ways, at a level it never had before by literally inventing trillions of dollars through quantitative easing and for these stimulus programs. So you have, what's the total? $3,200 to a normal average taxpayer, and literally mega trillions to corporations and banks.
Yeah, it should be understood that we are, let's take a step back. Capitalism as a system, in the 300 plus years it's been around, has experienced what we call business cycles or crashes or recessions or depressions. We have a lot of words because it's such a regular occurrence. And the National Bureau of Economic Research, which does a lot of this kind of periodizing research has done us a favor. It says that capitalism has a downturn on average every 4 to 7 years. That's the average. Everywhere in the world where capitalism has settled over 350 years, it has a downturn every 4 to 7 years. Now that's an average. Sometimes the downturns happen closer together. Sometimes they don't. They can last for a long time. Although there's an ironic twist in the sense that the longer we go before the next downturn hits, the more likely that downturn is going to be a doozy and be hard for us. So on average, every 4 to 7 years. And to drive the point home, let's take the United States in this new century, the 21st century. We had the so-called dot-com crash in the spring of 2000. We had the subprime mortgage crash in the autumn of 2008. And now we had the COVID crisis in 2020. We have 21 years, 3 crises right on schedule every 7 years. Unfortunately, these last 3, each one is worse than the one that went before. That's not a happy situation, to say the least. You might expect that a system that subjects its people to an irrational collapse every 4 to 7 years, when millions of people suddenly lose their jobs and industries come to a halt or shrink or literally disappear, that you would have tried to do something to cope with this kind of instability, because that's what it is. I often lean across the podium in my classes, because I've been a university teacher all my life. At this point, I lean across the podium and I say to the students, if you live with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. You know, and why don't you think about maybe that's what you need in this sphere as well? Well, the irony is the system has tried. For all 350 years, lots of very smart people living in capitalist societies have tried to overcome, to end, to soften, to moderate these cycles. We even have a kind of economics we name after a famous British economist, John Maynard Keynes. We call it Keynesian economics. And Mr. Keynes, in the middle of the Great Depression of the 30s, tried to figure out how you can manage to avoid this kind of regular calamity, because we can't really move out the way you could with an unstable roommate, because we don't know where we can go in a capitalist world that isn't also capitalist. And maybe we can come back to that later. But let me finish just this point. So they've tried, and we have to be honest now. They failed. They tried for 350 years. They failed. You know how we know they failed? Because we're in another one right now. They didn't do it. They couldn't do it. And that has to be faced, that there's a built-in mechanism that has resisted many generations of very smart men and women who have tried to come up with some way to stop it. All right, so then what do we do? Well, these are not very sophisticated mechanisms. That is all we have left. And what I'm about to describe has never solved the problem. What we do is we put Band-Aids on what is a cancer. And while it makes us feel better to put the Band-Aid on, at least we're doing something. It doesn't solve the problem. And as I'll show you in a minute, it often makes the problem worse. So let's take the Federal Reserve. The downturn hits, whether it's the Great Depression of the 1930s, whether it's the dot-com crisis 20 years ago, it doesn't really matter. And one of the first things that this society now does, the Band-Aid it reaches for, is called monetary policy. It has a variety of funny names: creating money, lowering interest rates, quantitative easing, and a dozen others. It doesn't matter. The basic idea is really simple. You create, I mean that literally, you create huge amounts of money and you heave them into the economy. You make it ridiculously cheap for anybody who wants to go to the government and get buckets full of this fresh new money. You all have noticed that the interest rates in this country came down about 15 years ago and have never gone back up. They hover barely below zero. That's an invitation to people and businesses to borrow money. And the idea here is, and talk about simple-mindedness, here it comes. The idea is that if I shovel money into the hands of a company or an individual, the company or the individual will now go out and buy things that'll have to be produced by people who will therefore get a job and will overcome the crisis. By the way, can that work? Yeah, sure it can. It's like facing the wrong way, heaving a dart over your shoulder. Can it hit the bullseye? You bet it can. But it's not really a brilliant way to go about this, because most of your darts, will hurt the other people in the bar. So yeah, it can work, but mostly it doesn't. Let me give you an example. Right now, for the last 10, 20 years, the Federal Reserve in our society, that's what we call our central bank, because it's just the history of our peculiar bank names. So we call it the Federal Reserve. It pumped wild, unprecedented amounts of money. It's doing it as I speak to you right now as well. Been doing it for years, trillions and trillions of dollars. Okay, the idea, the hope was this would get us out of a depressed economy. It would make our economy and our engine of our economic system soar. It did no such thing. Let me give you a simple summary. Over every year of this century, so 21 years, I could pick other numbers, but just to make it simple, 21 years of the 21st century, the average rate of growth of the United States output of goods and services was in the neighborhood of 2.5% per year, GDP growth. Over the same period of time, the average rate of growth of the output of goods and services in the People's Republic of China was between 8 and 10%. It's not even close. The Chinese are growing 3-4 times faster than the United States, year in and year out. All of this talk that this will put an engine, we will grow. It is the product of the southern end of a horse traveling north, right? It's not serious what we're doing here. It's make-believe. But if you repeat it often enough, and if no one calls it for what it is, people begin to believe it. So what happened to all that money? It didn't go into people's hands or business hands that spent it on producing goods and hiring people to make the goods to sell for all that money. It never happened. That dart heaved over your back shoulder didn't hit the bullseye. It didn't even hit the target. It punctured somebody's balloon or messed up somebody's beer. What did it do, though? Where did that dart go? I'll tell you where it went. It didn't go into producing goods and services because the American working class can't buy any more stuff. They're done. Their wages, in terms of what they could afford to buy, haven't gone up for 40 years. They were able to buy a bit more in the 80s and 90s, not because their wages went up, because they borrowed more money than any working class in the history of the world has ever borrowed, which is why they're up to their eyeballs in debt. mortgage debt, automobile payments, credit card debt, student debt. It's wild. It's crazy. Very few other countries do anything like this. We are real pioneers, only this time, not with the covered wagon and not with the horse. And luckily not killing the Native Americans either. So where did all the money go that was created? It didn't go into producing goods and services. And you know the reason? Because the distribution of income and wealth in America has become so extremely unequal, one of the most unequal in the world, that the mass of people don't have the money with which to buy. There is no mass market. You know where the mass market is growing? Here we go again, in the People's Republic of China. Why? Real wages in China over the last 30 years have quadrupled. Real wages in the United States have gone nowhere. You could not have a starker difference. The irony is American companies have been going to China for two very obvious reasons. The labor is cheaper and the market is growing faster than the United States. Either one of those reasons would be a magnet for companies to leave. To have the two at the same time, oh boy, is that a reason. And that's why under the radar, the companies are leaving left and right. They did before Trump, they did during Trump, and they're doing it again now. So where did the money then go? Well, let me answer my question. It went into the stock market. The money went there because you can make money there. You can't make money producing goods you can't sell here in the United States. So the money went where you could. You could buy a share of stock, hold it for a few months, and then sell it to another person just like you, who was borrowing money, just like you, from the Federal Reserve at virtually no interest rate, who bought the share from you at a higher price than you paid, and then hoped to do the same thing to the next person borrowing. And that's what we have. A crazy inflation, not in the way of goods and services, but in the way of a stock market. And there is the explanation for why our inequality got worse. 10% of Americans own about 80% of the shares. So if the stock market goes up, the 10% richest who own the shares become much richer still. So we have the spectacle of the last 16 months, a spectacle in which 82, by my latest count, 82 million Americans filed for unemployment compensation over the last 16 months. Some were only unemployed a few weeks. Some were unemployed the whole time and everything in between. But our labor force in this country is 160 million. If 82 million filed, it means more than half the workers in this country experienced some period of unemployment. When their income went down, when they had to eat up whatever savings they might have accumulated, when they became burdens on their family, their friends, and their community. And over the same time, little statistic, the 500 richest people in the world accumulated more wealth, and the more that they got was $8.4 trillion, all 500 together, over the same period. I mean, a system that treats the working class the way I just described, and the people at the top, this is out of control. This was way beyond dysfunctional. I can't use that word. It's too modest. This is obscene. And this kind of obscenity can only last if it has sedimented and been the norm for a very long time. That hasn't been the case in this country. The whole 20th century in America was a century in which the people who defended capitalism defended it on the grounds that it supported a vast, middle class. Yeah, there were a few richies at the top and a few desperado poors at the bottom, but we all patted each other on the back. We're all in the middle class. That's over, and it's not coming back. And the mass of the people are confronting a system that is giving them extreme equality, having literally spent the previous century promising that that would never happen here. I don't think that's a sustainable economic system. And I think, and I say this because I haven't felt this most of my life, so I'm not repeating something I've said before. I don't see a way out. In the past, I've seen capitalism's problems. And I've figured out, sometimes I saw it, sometimes I didn't, but there were ways you could see they could slither through. They could survive. They could get by. I don't see it now. I just don't see it. And I think we're a nation. My wife's a psychotherapist, so I apologize for psychological terminology. It slips out every now and then. But I think of us as a country in a state of extraordinary denial. We didn't understand what we just went through. We have had depressions and we have had pandemics, but we have never had a depression and a pandemic at the same time. That is disaster squared. That's catastrophe. That has to be, you have to understand what you're up against, or else the proposals you're going to make are silly. And to be blunt, Mr. Trump's were very silly, and Mr. Biden's are only marginally less silly. You're not going to do it this way. You're not going to slither through this time the way you did, because you have an enormous dislocation that has to be confronted. And unlike the Great Depression, you have a very powerful, successful competitor out there, which is why I mentioned China before. And I'm not interested in promoting hostility between the United States and China. It's the last thing we can afford. But China is an ascending power. China is in this century what the United States was in the last. You got to face that. You cannot pretend. If you pretend, then you're following the model, the sad model of Great Britain. We should be particularly clear, since that's the society we displaced. From being a little colony of Great Britain, they've become a little colony of ours. You better worry about that. You better think, how did that all come to pass? Otherwise we're going to replicate that. England is now a relatively poor, offshore, wet, cold island somewhere near Europe, not the British Empire. And the idea that this could never happen to the United States, well, that's got as much realism in it as the notion that we could have an economic system without the government.
Just to segue a little bit off of something you said around Biden, Trump having very silly policies and Biden's are just marginally less silly. Biden came out this week with an executive order saying that he's going to act on monopolies. He was talking about restoring the heart of capitalism. We are now 40 years into an experiment of letting giant corporations acquire more and more power. I believe the experiment has failed. Discussing neoliberalism. And he talks about capitalism without competition isn't capitalism, it's exploitation. For too many Americans, that means accepting a bad deal for things that can't go without. So is this a shift in the views of like the ruling class and of at least the Democrats, or is this just PR trying to kind of put a shine on like a really bad situation?
Well, the way I would describe it is, it's the understandable and actually in historical terms quite typical problem of a ruling group of people, whatever you want to call them, an elite, a ruling class, a lot of terms for this, recognizing that they've come to the end of one game that they've been playing quite successfully. The neoliberalism, the globalization, all of that. They understand now that the people who all along told them that this was a way of making the world much more unequal, much more violent, much more riven by powerful envy and bitterness and anger, they finally realized that those people were right, and that they were right long before the people in charge gave them the credit for it, which again is not so unusual, but we're living this boring repetition again. They now know that they have to change it, but they haven't a clue how to do it, because for 40 years they've been playing the same tune on the same drum, and they know they can't continue, but they don't. And this is an honest, at least some of them, when I talk to them, they honestly say, we don't know quite what to do. But you cannot be the president in this society, a society governed by advertising hype. You can't say, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm the president and I don't know quite what to do. This doesn't, you can't do that. It's like going out in the street and having forgotten your pants. You can't quite do that. The system doesn't allow it. So you make stuff up. And the stuff you make up can be pure platitudes. These are gestures, empty promises. Let me give you an example. George Bush said he was going to bring back manufacturing. Clinton said he's going to bring back manufacturing. Obama said he's going to bring back manufacturing. Trump said he's going, you get the picture? None of them did it. None of them. There's no appreciable growth. There's in fact continuing decline. That's the reality. And for damn good reasons that any half-baked economics professor can get rattled off, because it's very old news in our profession. The reasons why, okay? We've outsourced manufacturing, just like the British did before us, partly here. We've repeated it because we didn't understand what happened to them. And so we are going through it again. So here's what they do. They give lip service in the way that all of these, we're going to bring back manufacturing did. But they have a new problem, which I find very hopeful. And the new problem is that the American people, to my mind, to an extraordinarily surprising extent, at least I was surprised, have decided that it is now okay to be critical of capitalism. I'm a product of the period. I was born in Ohio. I've lived here all my life. I've worked here all my life. I grew up in a period of time, just like you did. I can tell from your, more or less my age, give or take. You know what I'm talking about.
The gray showing through.
Yeah, we've lived through a taboo. You can't talk about sex, and you can't talk about religion, and you can't talk about capitalism. You can criticize virtually anything. Americans are pretty good at being critical, but not capitalism. If you did that, then you're evil, you're a traitor, you're all of that crap. So you can't go anywhere near it. Suddenly, historical time, suddenly, Bernie Sanders, well, let's be fair. Before Bernie, a bunch of kids here in New York City, young people, set up tents in a nondescript little park right off Wall Street and announce that they're occupying Wall Street, which makes most people pay no attention and a few people giggle. I'm grateful that these people never came to me to ask my advice. Should we do that? Because I would have told them it's ridiculous. No, 12 homeless people will come to get free sandwiches, which is nice. And you'll give them sandwiches and it'll make you feel better. And that's nice. And the police won't bother you because they don't care. And then in the evening, they'll clean it up. And this will be one of those non-events that you can tell your grandchildren about. I'm glad they never came to me, because that would have been the worst conceivable advice that I would have given them. Because something was going on that those people sensed that I didn't. You could stand up, and for the first time in my adult life in the United States, a major national movement could put an economic issue to the forefront. Not discrimination and racism, not feminism, not ecological. No, the economic, the 1% versus the 99%. A brilliant slogan, the right moment, the right thing to say. None of that I would have been able to figure out. None of it I would have dared. And then in 2016, Bernie, and then in 2020, Bernie again, and now Ocasio-Cortez and the whole expanding socialist or DSA or whatever you want to call it. This is amazing that they could be this strong after 70 years of relentless propaganda, demonizing all of this kind of talk and this kind of analysis. And that puts another pressure. You can't just say, well, we'll bring back manufacturing. That just won't do. The Democratic Party is now torn. If it drives away the progressives that are in it, it's done. And they know it. Whatever BS they say, they know it. So here's what we got. The center of the Democratic Party in charge. It is doing Clinton, Obama over again, which should surprise nobody, because that's who they are. They're Clinton, Obama over again, literally. They know they have to do more because the situation is so much graver. Yes, of course, they're going to do it all bigger amounts. And for the progressives, they're going to talk lots of stuff. You know, it is an attempt to hold that party together. So we get all this stuff about hostility to the big corporations. Oh, sure. Yeah. I'll believe that when I see it. At this point, I don't see it. I see those speeches as written by people like me, hired by the Googles of this world. You know, yeah, if you read the speech closely, it's full of what he's going to recommend, what he's in favor of. There are no teeth. There's no concrete, this is going to happen, and here's how it's going to be. None of that. So for me, this is the early stage. They may end up doing more. I think that's possible. But I think that's more dependent on the level of social disintegration than anything else, and the power of the progressives. That those two things will determine whether this goes beyond the first stage. And I don't want to be disrespectful. It's important to say something. He has had to say something. By the way, let's remember, Mr. Biden is a senator from Delaware. That's the place all large corporations go, because more than every other state in the country, it's created as a breeding ground for corporations. It doesn't ask much of them. It gives them loads of discretion, and they don't even get that in most other states. The rest of this country is still scrambling. I mean, the Dakotas have done a decent job, and a few others, of catching up to Delaware, but it's still, you know, this is not the man to take us down the road of playing tough with the corporations. He's a creature of the corporation. They've endorsed him and backed him and funded him from the beginning of his time. If it weren't for them, he wouldn't be the president, and he knows it. And so do they. So I think, look, it's significant that he would even say what he said. So he said it. In my view, he's hoping that saying it will be enough, that he'll get through, that progressives will be happy that he's at least saying it. Nobody else was ready quite to say it. Just like he's doing a bit more. take the child's credit, the one that started, I believe, yesterday, the extra $300 a month for kids that are under 6 and a little less for kids that are over 6. Yeah, it's only temporary. It only goes for the rest of the year, which is less than a year, and all the rest. But you know, most other advanced industrial countries have been doing this for decades. It's the law in England. It's a law in Canada. Ireland does it, but with no income. In the United States, you have to be eligible for it. Many families aren't. If your income is above a certain amount, you don't get anything. If it's in another range, you get less than the 300. Ireland doesn't do that. Ireland gives a subsidy for every kid, no eligibility. Everybody gets it. You don't have to be needy. You don't have to show need to get it, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so the United States is limping along after everybody else, and it's only doing it temporary. It's been the law for decades in these other countries. I mean, there's only the lack of knowing this prevents the mockery that this should be getting from the American people. I mean, this is pathetic what you're doing. And then on top of the pathos, you're only doing it till the end of the year? Oh, but for God's sake, that's how you limp up behind other countries that are much, much less wealthy than you are? I love to remind people that in December of 2017, when Trump and the Republicans gave that tax cut, it was never brought up that that tax cut should only go to those corporations that were needy, you know, whose profits had been squeezed in the years before, or whose reserves were not of a certain amount. You know, we shouldn't be funding with a tax cut companies that are roaring with wealth. That wouldn't be a problem. None of that. The Republicans didn't say that, and the Democrats didn't say it either. You know, what? And now we have these same men and women sitting there discussing who is eligible to get $300 a month for a kid. Holy mackerel. What kind of society works like this?
You mentioned a minute ago about how politicians are always saying they're going to bring back manufacturing. And right now I'm sitting about 15 minutes away from what used to be Packard Electric, Lordstown GM, Republic Steel. And every 4 years, politicians discover Youngstown. They all come out here. The rest of the time, you know, it doesn't exist, but every 4 years, the media discovers Youngstown. The New York Times is here, Washington Post is here. You know, well, I don't think Hillary Clinton was here, which is why she lost. But
right.
And these same people, when you know, not that long ago, and you're aware of Youngstown as well as I am, this was a very labor-oriented area, heavy union membership, voted Democratic. Glenn and Metzenbaum, you know, as far as senators go, we're probably as good as you're going to get. In the last election, I think it was voted 57% Donald Trump. And these areas in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio, which are increasingly poor, increasingly part of that old, what used to be unionized working class, are now really part of the GOP base. And I just wondered, you know, we have this vast inequality. We are talking about it now, but somehow people like Trump have managed to take advantage of that and jump on it and convince people that Democrats don't care about him, which is probably true, but somehow convince them also that he gave a damn. Like, because I have working class people here who, you know, the Democrats don't care about me. It's like, yeah, you're right. But Donald Trump's like, you know, how's that happen that these unionized working class areas of, you know, people who used to have good jobs at GM, at Lordstown, at Packard, you know, get a good retirement plan, buy a car, buy a boat, send their kids to college, who are, and they're now the GOP base. Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, that's the great question that stands before us as the test of whether we're going to be able to come up with a strategy that turns all this stuff around. We have to answer that question. So let me tell you as far as I've gotten working on. I don't think the Republicans won these people. I think the Democrats lost them.
Yeah.
I think the Democrats bear the responsibility. They came out of the Great Depression with a mandate and a base and a support that should have meant that they run at least a century virtually unopposed. Let's remember, Roosevelt was forced from below. He had the CIO, the greatest unionization drive in the history of the United States. We've never had anything like it before. We've never had anything like it since. In the depths of the Depression, the American working class went sharply to the left. It organized the CIO, and the CIO did it together, despite all their differences and disagreements, with two different socialist parties and the Communist Party. And those were important parties in the 1930s when they got big membership, and they basically formed that coalition, communists, socialists, and CIO. And what did they achieve? Well, they went basically, in so many words, they went to Roosevelt and they said, you've got to do something to get the mass of the American people through this horrific depression. If you do, you will walk on water, because we've organized millions of people who are going to see you, because we're going to make sure of it, as the man of the hour who saved us, who let us keep our home, got us a job, all the rest. And if you don't, we will not support you, and you won't be dog catcher, let alone governor of New York or president. And, you didn't have to say that. Roosevelt was a smart cookie. He understood exactly what this game was, and he understood that he would have to go back to the corporations and the rich, tell them what he had heard, and then give them his opinion. And his opinion was, if you don't give me the wherewithal to meet these folks halfway, we're going to have a revolution here the way they did in 1917 in Russia. Remember, we're talking the early 30s. 1917 is not a long time in the past at that time. And the socialists and the Communist Party were talking like that. So it was in the air. And Roosevelt cut a deal. He said, I'm going to give you more than you asked to take care of people. But I'm only going to do it if you stop this revolution talk. That I can't work with that. Then I can't get the portion of the ruling class to go with this game. He got what he wanted. He got the deal. Yeah, there were always a few left-wingers who yelled that he had sold out. That was always true. Some communists did it. Some of the Trotskyites in the Socialist Workers' Party did that. But they basically bought the deal. They really did. And the better ones of them admitted. And so now we had a deal. And what did he do? Social Security, unemployment compensation, the minimum wage, and a government jobs program. Staggering. And all of that in a handful of years. Wow. No president had ever done this before. Better yet, how did he pay for it? He jacked up the taxes on corporations and the rich. That was the deal. They would give him the money because the government didn't have the money, and they didn't understand that they could print it quite the way they do these days. So they didn't do that. They didn't think it was possible. Okay, and then what happened? Mr. Roosevelt is reelected 3 times. No president had ever had that before. The man walked on water. I remember as a child being I grew up in Youngstown, places like that, where people would have a little picture of Roosevelt on the wall, and they would virtually talk about it, if it was a Catholic household, like he was the Pope, like he was some sort of magic, somebody close to the big guy up there who was making all this possible. And that was a sign of just unspeakable support. So now we get to 1945. And I think at that moment, the Democratic Party could have done anything it wanted. It was the party that had saved the country, saved the mass of the people. Capitalism was in deep disrepute. You didn't just have the unions fighting in the workplace, but you had all the socialists and communists and liberals working with them talking all the time about how the government is saving us. The government is the solution and private capitalism is the problem. And everybody nodded. Yep, pretty much. That's it. And then they lost it. Why? Because the people on the other side, the corporations, the rich, who had to pay the money to take care of the mass of people, which outraged them ideologically, politically, in their pocketbook, they were out, they didn't know which way to get angrier. And they got together and they were smart. And they figured out Roosevelt wasn't the problem. He wouldn't have done it. You remember when Roosevelt runs in 1932, he's a middle of the road Democrat. He's a Biden. He wants a balanced budget, all that junk that those people said in those years. So he had to be pushed. So that the right wing knew that. Roosevelt isn't the problem. His second in command, Harry Truman, isn't the problem. Even the little bit of scary Henry Wallace wasn't the problem. The problem was the coalition that made those people powerful and dangerous. That had to be destroyed. And you know, when you want to destroy a coalition, everybody who's ever been involved in this understands it. The first question is, what's the weakest link? You know, who in this game is the vulnerable one? And they came on the communists because they could be redefined as agents of Russia, evil, foreign, all of that. So you could destroy them. And that's how this was done. You destroyed them first. You arrested them, you deported them, you demonized them. And as soon as you had them squashed, you went around the country and you could convince the American people that socialists are exactly like communists. They just spell it differently. That's all that this is. You know, I tell you this in all honesty. My parents were immigrants. My mother was German, my father was French. And I speak those languages because I grew up speaking those languages. And I remember when I used to go to Europe, I would discover that everybody, educated people, uneducated, they all knew the difference between a socialist and a communist, a Trotskyist and a Stalinist and an anarchist. And they knew all of it because these were people in the community, people in their family who fought these issues out at family reunions and picnics, but not in America. I remember beginning to teach my first class, the first class I ever taught, by the way, at Yale University, no less. That's where I got my PhD, so I'm teaching there. And I realized my class, my students, who were perfectly smart young men and women, wasn't that, but they thought that Marxism, Marxist, socialist, communist, liberal, unionist, terrorist, it's all the same. These are synonyms. It's just an excess of words for the very same thing. It's not just that they believed it, they knew it. They articulated it with a confidence that you either have to be very smart or a raving idiot, but there's no in between. But at first I thought they were stupid, but they weren't stupid. They were good Americans. That's what they had learned. This is all evil. So we destroyed, long story short, we destroyed the left. And here's why that's important. Not ideologically, I mean, I'm on the left, so I was sad about all of that, but analyze it kind of ruthlessly. What was happening here was that you were splitting the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party didn't understand. It thought it could get rid of these lefties, the communists, the socialists, all of those people, and those are the fellow travelers, you know, all the ones scared, even though they would never joined these organizations, but they were scared. It thought it could get rid of those and it wouldn't cost them anything. So they went along with the Republican conservative push, thinking that it wasn't my problem, get rid of those people. No. Here's the problem. If all you're left with is the apparatus of the Democratic Party and the labor movement, because they had that. Remember, they split the labor movement. They carved the unions in half. the electrical workers became the IBEW instead of the UE, and all of those distinctions. If they couldn't take over the union, they split it in half. All of that. They were left with a skeleton of the labor movement and no mass organizations out there handing out the leaflets, teaching the classes, writing the letters to the editor of the news. They lost what was then the way to make a general argument in the population. And the unions then began to shrivel, because you can't do it just with the worker in the factory. You have to have the church reinforce it, and the school reinforce it, and the mass media. Otherwise, you're leaving the rest of people's lives to your enemy. And even if you hold on to your position in the factory, you're not getting the allies that you always needed, and which got you into the position under Roosevelt. They let it go, the dumb Democrats, and they became less and less powerful. And instead of building on what they had accomplished in the 30s, which was the promise of the Democratic Party to the working class, see what we did in the 30s? Yes, said everybody. Well, we're going to build on that, and we're going to make your life really good. Look what we did. We got you through the hard times. Now the war is over. Now the depression is behind us. And instead, they couldn't even hold on to what they had gotten. They couldn't. Look at it. The minimum wage now is a joke. It's been eviscerated by the inflation. We just went through a horrible period of unemployment. No major political force talked about government jobs. Didn't even bring it up, even though we hired 15 million people in the 1930s. That's success, when you can control the narrative so that there's not even a conversation about one of the most basic programs that worked in the United States. You couldn't bring it up. Social Security being pinched instead of being expanded. Unemployment compensation, ditto. I mean, this is pathetic. What the Democratic Party did was step by step make itself less in the minds of the mass of its own people. So in the end, and this is my experience, and I lived most of my life in Connecticut, and you may think of Connecticut as a big wealthy state, but that's really only part of it. It's actually an industrial. A good part of it is an industrial state. I lived in New Haven because I went to Yale and I taught at Yale and stuff like that. But Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport are industrial cities. And that's where I worked politically with the Democratic Party, let me be clear. And I know what those people felt when they talked to me all the time. And they felt betrayed by the Democratic Party, let down step by step. They had no illusions that the Republicans were their friends, none. They didn't believe it, none of it. And they would not have followed Mr. Trump, except he did two things that they really liked. He gave, in a vivid way, he gave the finger to the Republican establishment. That made him the only Republican that would be acceptable to them, right there in that act. He seemed to have more moxie in flipping off Mr. Bush than any Democrat dared to do. And the second thing is he made a joke. He kind of mocked the whole fakery of American politics, this Tweedledum, Tweedledee. Now we have a Republican, now we have a Democrat. First we have someone from the Bush family, then we have someone from the Clinton family. I mean, Jesus Christ, these people who all presided over the period when we lost everything. We don't, I mean, we're in debt up to here. We can't function. And then they want these poor black people and brown people to come here and make it easy. Our neighborhoods will look like theirs. You could just see. And Mr. Trump became attractive because he said that. He had the parts of his anatomy, I won't mention them, that would allow him to say, all Mexicans are rapists and all the other crazy junk But that crazy junk is supported by people, not who they don't agree with it. They know that that's silly. They really do. But it's somebody talking about what they're afraid of. And they are afraid. In New Haven, in Hartford, and Bridgeport, the poor neighborhoods are growing and the middle-class neighborhoods are shrinking, and everybody knows it. Everybody sees it. Everybody walks and drives through it. You got to deal with this somehow. And the existing politicians pretended there was nothing going on, nothing important, nothing that needed any kind of adjustment. And he made fun of them. And look, it was 3/4 a sense of betrayal by the Democrats, and only 1/4 anything having to do with if you ask most of the workers in New Haven who work there, we have a big, Connecticut is a big arms industry, has been for a long time. We make jet airplanes, Pratt Whitney jet airlines, and armaments of all kinds. If you talk to those workers, they will tell you proudly that they have been members of the International Association of Machinists from time immemorial. They consider themselves working people. They don't like the Republican Party, but they're very proud that they voted for Donald Trump. Because, and then the words come out, he seems to care. But stop for a minute with me and ask yourself, like a psychologist would, what is being said there? They obviously don't mean he cares for me personally. He doesn't know me. I don't know him. He can't. He somehow was able to push the Democrats out of the story. It's not that these workers think the Republican Party cares for them. They have no illusion about that. They didn't vote for the Republican Party, by the way. They voted for Donald Trump because he gave the finger to all of the people they want to give the finger to, which includes the Republicans and the Democrats. He gave them all the bird. Nah, you're crap. You've done nothing for me. You ripped me off. Nah. And they were willing. I wish they weren't, but they were willing to look beyond the fact that he's a billionaire, to look beyond the fact that he's a sleazy real estate hustler and all the rest of that. They know it, but they need somebody. And here, in case you're interested, let me be the psychologist economist. If the Democrats dare to put someone up there who's willing on their side to play this game, they'll win these people like that. We will be as surprised. Look, you know who could have done it? And I'm not naive about these things. I worked for many years in the Democratic Party. I've been active politically. I ran for mayor of New Haven, Connecticut, and stuff. I've been active. I know how the game is played. If Bernie Sanders had only been 20 years younger and done it right, he could have beaten Mr. Trump. I'm convinced of it. Precisely to the extent that if he didn't do it, but if he did on the left, had the dare to do what Trump did on the right, that would have been that would have torn these workers. They wouldn't have known what to do. And in the end, they would have liked the Bernie, the very grandpa that he is. They would have liked that better than this sleazy New York real estate man who they had lots of doubts about.
Steve Bannon actually said that they were more afraid of Sanders in 2016, but it also says a lot about the political parties when the Republicans who despise Trump, he got their nomination. The Democrats did everything they could to prevent Sanders. So actually the Republicans were more Democratic than the Democrats were, but thank you so much. I'm so happy we got a chance as a professor who teaches a lot of this stuff, having you and others out there in the public talking about this is really important to me, and it helps me a lot. So I really want to thank you for joining us today, and I enjoy your podcast and everything you write. And so, maybe we can get you back sometime because I have a million more questions. I didn't even talk about tariffs or woke capitalism or any of that stuff. So anyway,
Yeah, we
thank you so
can.
much.
I'd love to. And let me mention one more thing you might want to use or not use.
Yeah.
In a way, we are all people like us. And I include here Bernie and Ocasio-Cortez and all the rest. We are being swept along by something much bigger than any of us. You know, I can tell you, I'm overwhelmed by what has happened. I've been a teacher all my life. I now do, you are the fourth interview I have done today, and I normally have 4 to 5. The others that today were television and radio. I could be like doing it all day long. The interest in what we are saying, the audience, it keeps exploding. You know, I've been doing this now for 10 years. I started basically in 2011. And, you know, I have my own radio and television show. I do all these interviews. I write. I have a team that works with me now. I couldn't possibly do all this myself. But all of it is testimony. I didn't have the staff or the money or anything to go out and build all of this. This has all come to us, you know, but that's the best news in the world. It isn't us. It isn't us. We're just, you know, creatures of something that's going on there. And that's the best thing, because when we falter or when we die out, they're coming. We don't have to worry. We really don't, for the first time in a long time. You know, I teach Marxian economics. I learned from Karl Marx. I'm making sure, especially as I get older, that I'm not going to participate in this dismissal of Marxism. I'm just not going to do it. So if people ask me, are you Marxist? I am sure, because, you know, what are they going to do? I'm done with my teaching. I have my pension. I don't care. And if it's people like me that have to do it so that the younger people have the space within which to function. Besides which, it's childishly easy to make fun of the folks who made a point of never learning Marxism, as if it was a virtue to not know anything about this paradigm. But here's what I want to tell you. Every year for the last 10, my audience grows. The demand for my time, the publication of my writings, the invitations, it's just, I mean, I'm blown away. And I want you to know that, and I want your audience to know it. We are not a beleaguered, tiny minority in this country. We're just not. We may never have been, but we sure thought we were for a long time. But now it's crystal clear. We are not. There are huge numbers of people out there who vibrate to the kinds of things we variously try to get across. Who, you know, when I first began, and people would raise their hands and they say, I have a question about socialism. And I would groan inwardly because I would, oh, they're going to tell me about how Stalin killed a lot of people. Isn't that awful? And I would say, yeah, that's awful. But, you know, now they don't, that's not the question. They raise their hand, have a question about socialism. You know what the question is? What is it? But it's not asked from the hostile position. They really want to know. It's so sad. They don't know. All those polls you see where young people are saying, you know, I don't like capitalism very much. I find socialism interesting. The truth of it is, they don't know anything about socialism. It's really sad. Not surprising, because nothing has been taught to them. But they know they don't like capitalism because that they got, and they can see that that's not working out for them and their family. So they're critical of capitalism, and they're willing to say something positive about socialism. But you know what they want? They want it laid out. They want to understand what it is, what the different kinds of it are, what's at stake, and then they're going to make a decision. That is a very, very good position for the likes of us to be in. It's like learning that your neighborhood has an unbelievable, exciting feeling about finally getting to taste Greek food, and you happen to be a Greek restaurant person, and you're coming into town and you got what they want. It's just a question of setting it up and getting the souvlaki going, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway.
Professor Wolff, it's been great talking to you today.
Okay.
Folks, if you want to check us out, Green Red Podcast, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. This interview will be on YouTube. And if you want to become a donor, check us out at patreon.com/Green Red Podcast and go to greenredpodcast.org and hit the support button. It's been wonderful talking to you today. It's really would like to have you back at some point to talk more. We had a whole other list of questions that we wanted to talk about, but we kind of ran out of time. So,
all right. Well, you have the questions. I'll be glad to do it again.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks so much. I
Thanks.
really appreciate it. And hello from Hap, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Bye-bye.
Right. Take care.
Working at this job is dirty and dangerous, and I'm taking risks anyway. Oh, if I had the time and the proper equipment, I could do my job safely each day. Everybody here says they're sticklers for safety, and I'm not here to say that they lie. I'm saying we just come to work here. We don't come to die. Now I don't want your chemicals clouding my brain. I wanna keep all of my fingers and toes. I wanna hear those cheers at both of my ears when my working days come to a close. Work that I do here is dangerous enough. Don't you rush me, and I'm telling you why. We just come to work here. We don't come to die. Now while you're up there talking in an air-conditioned office on a telephone that's OSHA approved, go on and tell me how much you've been spending on safety. Pardon me, I'm not moved. There's only one way to put an end to the slaughter. Just look your boss right in the eye and say, we just come to work here. We don't come to die. We sat still through 8 years of Reagan, watched OSHA brought down to its knees. Saw lots of union busting and watched our plants rusting while our jobs were shipped overseas. 60,000 workers that we buried last year found the cost of doing business too high. We just come to work here. We don't come to die. Now while you're up there talking in an air-conditioned office on a telephone that's OSHA approved, go on and tell me how much you've been spending on safety. Pardon me, I'm not moved. There's only one way to put an end to the slaughter. Just look your boss right in the eye. Tell him we just